She collapsed in the rain with nothing left to lose, until a cowboy lifted her from the mud and gave her a reason to breathe again.
Subscribe to Wild Sky Stories. Turn on the bell icon so you can do not miss any new video.
The flames had painted the sky orange and red, colors that would haunt Clara Mitchell's dreams for years to come. She stood barefoot in the dirt road, her nightgown torn and blackened, watching her entire life collapse into ash and ember. The small farmhouse where she had been born, where her mother had taught her to bake bread and her father had read scripture by candlelight, was nothing more than a skeleton of timber now, groaning as it surrendered to the fire's hunger. They said it started in the barn, lightning perhaps, or a lantern left burning. Clara would never know for certain. What she knew was this: she had woken to screaming, to heat so fierce it seemed to press against her skin like a living thing. She had crawled through the window of her small bedroom, tumbling onto the hard ground below, calling out for her parents, for anyone. But the fire had been faster than her cries, and by the time the neighbors arrived with their buckets and their prayers, there was nothing left to save. Clara was 23 years old, orphaned in a single night, with nothing to her name but a burned nightgown and the small gold locket her grandmother had given her, which she never removed, not even for sleeping. The locket had survived. Her parents had not. The town of Dusty Creek, Texas, did what small towns do in the face of tragedy. They gathered around her with covered dishes and whispered condolences. The preacher's wife offered her a bed in their spare room, but Clara could see the hesitation in the woman's eyes, the unspoken calculation of how long charity could last before it became burden. The general store owner's daughter brought her a dress that was too large and smelled of cedar, and Clara wore it because she had nothing else. For 3 weeks, Clara drifted through the town like a ghost, eating little, speaking less. She helped where she could, washing dishes at the boarding house, mending clothes for the elderly widow on Maple Street, but she had no plan, no future she could see beyond the next meal, the next night spent in a borrowed bed. The weight of her grief was so heavy that some mornings she could barely lift her head from the pillow. It was on such a morning, gray and cold despite the approaching summer, that Clara found herself walking along the road that led out of town. She had no destination in mind, only the vague sense that if she kept moving, the pain might not catch up with her. The sky hung low and threatening, and thunder rumbled somewhere in the distance, but Clara did not turn back. Let the rain come, she thought. Let it wash her away entirely. She walked for miles, until her borrowed shoes raised blisters on her heels and her legs trembled with exhaustion. The road wound through cattle country now, vast stretches of grassland dotted with oak trees and the occasional windmill. Clara had never been this far from town before. She did not know where she was going, only that she could not go back. The rain began as a whisper, then a roar. Within minutes, Clara was soaked through, her dress clinging to her thin frame, her hair plastered against her face. She stumbled off the road, seeking shelter beneath a cluster of trees, but the wind drove the rain sideways, and there was no escape from its cold assault. She sank to her knees in the mud, too exhausted to cry, too hollow to pray. That was how Jackson Cole found her. He was riding home from checking on a sick calf in the far pasture, when he spotted the figure huddled beneath the oak tree. At first he thought it might be one of his ranch hands, caught out in the storm, but as he drew closer, he saw the dress, the long dark hair, the pale face turned up toward the weeping sky. He dismounted in one fluid motion and approached slowly, the way he would approach a frightened horse. "Ma'am?" His voice was deep but gentle, barely audible above the rain. "Are you hurt?" Clara looked up at him through the water streaming down her face. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a weathered hat that did little to keep the rain from his eyes. Those eyes were kind, she noticed, gray-blue, like the sky before a storm, and filled with genuine concern. "I don't know," she whispered, and it was the truest thing she had ever said. Jackson Cole did not ask any more questions. He simply removed his coat and wrapped it around her shaking shoulders, then lifted her onto his horse as if she weighed nothing at all. He climbed up behind her, one arm holding the reins, the other keeping her steady against his chest, and he rode toward home. The Cole ranch was modest but well kept, a 2-story farmhouse with a wide porch and a barn that had been recently painted red. Jackson carried Clara inside, calling out for his housekeeper, a stout woman named Bessie who clucked her tongue at the sight of the bedraggled stranger but immediately set about heating water for a bath and finding dry clothes. Clara learned these things later, in fragments. At the time, she was barely conscious, shivering so violently that her teeth rattled in her skull. She remembered strong hands lowering her into warm water, remembered a woman's voice murmuring reassurances, remembered being wrapped in soft blankets and placed in a bed that smelled of lavender and cedar. Then she slept, and for the first time since the fire, she did not dream. When she woke, sunlight was streaming through lace curtains and the smell of coffee and bacon drifted up from somewhere below. Clara sat up slowly, taking in her surroundings. The room was simple but comfortable, with whitewashed walls and a braided rug on the floor. A vase of wildflowers sat on the dresser, and beside it, a pitcher of fresh water and a clean towel. She found her borrowed dress, now washed and pressed, hanging on a hook by the door. She dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, her heart hammering with uncertainty. She had no claim on this house, on these people. She was a stranger who had collapsed on their land, and now she would have to explain herself, would have to bear the weight of their pity, or worse, their suspicion. But when she entered the kitchen, Jackson Cole simply looked up from his breakfast and smiled. Feeling better, Clara nodded, suddenly aware of how she must look, pale, thin, with shadows beneath her eyes that no amount of sleep could erase. "I'm sorry to have troubled you. I'll be on my way as soon as—" "Sit down," Bessie interrupted, steering Clara toward a chair. "You'll do no such thing until you've got some food in you. Lord knows you look like you haven't had a proper meal in weeks." Clara wanted to protest, but her body betrayed her, sinking gratefully into the chair as Bessie set a plate before her piled high with eggs and bacon and biscuits still steaming from the oven. She ate without tasting, without thinking, while Jackson Cole watched her with those quiet, thoughtful eyes. Over the next few days, Clara learned the story of the man who had saved her. Jackson Cole was 31 years old, the only son of a rancher who had died 5 years earlier, leaving him the land and the cattle and the weight of a legacy he had never asked for. He had been engaged once to a school teacher from Austin who had decided in the end that she preferred city life to the isolation of a cat. L'Orange. He did not speak of her often, but when he did, there was no bitterness in his voice, only a quiet acceptance that some things were not meant to be. Clara told him about the fire on her 3rd night at the ranch. They were sitting on the porch, watching the stars emerge one by one in the vast Texas sky, and the words came spilling out of her like water from a broken dam. She told him about her parents, about the life she had lost, about the weeks of wandering and grief that had led her to collapse beneath that oak tree in the rain. Jackson listened without interrupting, and when she finally fell silent, tears streaming down her cheeks, he reached over and took her hand in his. "You're safe here," he said simply. "Stay as long as you need." Clara meant to leave. She told herself every morning that this would be the day she would thank them for their kindness and set off to find her own way in the world. But the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, and somehow she never left. She made herself useful, helping Bessie with the cooking and cleaning, learning to tend the vegetable garden behind the house. She mended clothes for the ranch hands and kept the accounts when Jackson discovered she had a talent for numbers. Slowly, tentatively, she began to feel something she had thought lost forever, a sense of belonging. And then there was Jackson himself. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He made sure Clara had everything she needed without ever making her feel like a charity case. He asked for her opinions on matters of the ranch and listened carefully when she gave them. He brought her wildflowers from the pasture, claimed he had picked them for the kitchen table, but Bessie told Clara with a knowing smile that he had never bothered with such things before. Clara tried to guard her heart. She had lost too much already, and the thought of caring for someone only to lose them again was more than she could bear. But Jackson Cole was persistent in his quiet way, and before she knew it, he had slipped past her defenses like sunlight through a cracked door. The first time he kissed her, it was autumn, and the leaves on the oak trees had turned to gold. They had been out riding together, checking on the herd in the north pasture, and on the way back, Jackson had stopped his horse beside a small creek that wound through the property. The water sparkled in the late afternoon light, and the air smelled of sage and approaching rain. "Clara," he said, and there was something different in his voice, something raw and vulnerable that made her heart skip. "I need to tell you something." She waited, hardly breathing. "When I found you that day, I thought you were the saddest thing I'd ever seen, and I wanted nothing more than to take that sadness away." He paused, struggling for words. "I didn't expect to fall in love with you, but I have, completely, and I know you've been through more pain than any person should have to bear, and I know you might not feel the same way, but I couldn't go another day without telling you." Clara kissed him before he could finish. She kissed him with all the grief and hope and fear and longing that had been building inside her for months, and when she finally pulled away, breathless, she saw that his eyes were shining with tears. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I have for a long time." They were married in the spring, in a small ceremony on the porch of the ranch house, with Bessie crying happy tears and the ranch hands shifting awkwardly in their Sunday best. Clara wore a white dress that Bessie had sewn herself, and in her hand, she carried a bouquet of wildflowers that Jackson had picked that morning from the pasture where he had first found her. As she spoke her vows, Clara thought of her parents, of the life she had lost, of the grief that still lived inside her like a small, quiet flame. But she thought also of the man standing before her, of the home he had opened to her, of the love that had grown between them in the most unexpected of circumstances. The night had taken everything from her, but it had also led her here, to this moment, to this man, to a future she had never dared to imagine. That night, as they sat together on the porch watching the stars emerge, Jackson wrapped his arm around her shoulders and pulled her close. "Happy?" he asked. Clara leaned into him, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. "More than I ever thought possible," and for the first time since the fire she believed it. The years that followed were not without their struggles. Cattle prices fell, droughts came and went, and one terrible winter, they lost nearly half the herd to a sickness that swept through the territory. But through it all, Clara and Jackson faced each challenge together, their love serving as an anchor in the storm. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, who filled the old farmhouse with laughter and chaos and joy. Clara taught them to read and write, to tend the garden, to treat every living thing with kindness. Jackson taught them to ride, to rope, to respect the land that sustained them. And in the evenings the family would gather on the porch, watching the sun set over the pastures, grateful for each other and for the life they had built. Clara never forgot her parents. She kept their memory alive through stories, through the recipes her mother had taught her, through the gold locket she still wore against her heart. But the grief that had once threatened to consume her had transformed over the years into something gentler, something she could carry without being crushed. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, Jackson presented Clara with a gift, a small wooden box, carved with wildflowers, containing a letter he had written on the night he realized he loved her. "I never gave this to you," he said almost shyly. "I was too afraid. Clara read the letter through tears, her heart so full it ached. In it, Jackson had poured out his soul, his fears, his hopes, his desperate wish that she might someday love him back. It was raw and honest and beautiful, and when she finished reading, she threw her arms around him and held on as if she would never let go. "Thank you," she whispered, "for finding me, for saving me, for giving me a home." Jackson kissed her forehead, his arms tightening around her. "You saved me too, Clara. You just don't know it." But she did know. She had seen the loneliness in his eyes when they first met, had watched it fade as their lives became intertwined. They had saved each other, these two wounded souls, and in doing so, they had created something beautiful, a love that would endure long after they were gone, passed down through generations like the most precious of heirlooms. The night had taken everything from Clara Mitchell, but a cowboy had opened his home, and in that simple act of kindness, he had given her back her life.